I'm Corey House. I'm from Kansas City. I specialize in React and front ends and JavaScript. I've been writing JavaScript since about 98 or so, when it was very painful. Life is amazing today. You kids have no idea how good things are. This is why I'm smiling. I really enjoy reusable components today in React, but that said, the story in Vue, the story in Svelte, the story in Ember, the story in Angular, all of them are really good. And everything I'm talking about in here applies to all those as well. And that wasn't an exhaustive list either. If I left your horse out, I can hardly keep track anymore. I'm going to show a little bit of code, but it's going to be React, and you're not going to have to really understand React to get it. It'll be quite straightforward. But I want to clarify what keeps me busy. So a client that came to me just a few weeks ago said, we need your help because we're in a bad spot. We have been doing development for a while, and we went down the road of trying to create reusable components. We tried to do that very quickly as part of an effort to build a couple different applications, and we quickly realized that it wasn't going to work. The components weren't really fitting in well. They worked in this app and not in this app, and developers kept stepping on each other's toes trying to create the same reusable component in slightly different ways. They couldn't agree on APIs. Lots of problems. And I'm curious, has anybody in here tried and failed to create a reusable component library? Good! That's why you're here. I'm like the doctor and you're all sick. So, and the fact that you're wearing masks, it's all apropos. This is great. Well, the reason that they got in that situation is order of operations. So there's a foundational mistake that I see being made all over in reusable components, which is, the foundation is, if you're going to have reusable components, you got to pay for it. And by pay for it, I mean you need to pay at least one full-time developer to do nothing but reusable components. That is that person's job all day long. If you do not do that, in my experience, they will fail. Because there is no such thing as a reusable component library that is done. For the same reason that it's pretty hard to find an application that's in production that you can say is done, and you just leave it be. Now, my blog is, because, man, I haven't posted it in a while, but it's still running. It's done. I will soon. But this concept, I'm curious. So how many in here are successful then? You have reusable components in production, shared around. So the other side, so the interesting thing is in here, the minority, that's probably 15% of the room says, yeah, we've got a reusable component library out there. You'll get insights from here too. So this talk, though, is important to me because I believe this, that society advances the more things that we can take for granted. Like, we're in here today having this experience because we took for granted that we could come to the Kalahari, that even though it's really cold, they would have heat. The electricity would work. The projector would work. The chairs wouldn't collapse. Our masks would keep us safe. Maybe, yeah? And so on and so on. All of these things that we're taking for granted. Reusable components effectively give us a long list of things that we can take for granted. Well-done reusable components mean, for instance, I have this opaque component. And by opaque, I mean I don't really need to worry about what it does behind the scenes. I pass it some settings, and it magically does the right thing. We can make doing the right thing the automatic thing. And that is a wonderful benefit. Now, the tricky thing about reusable components is the number of decisions. And I'm going to let this churn for a bit. This is what keeps me busy as a consultant. So I told you I'm a consultant. This is what I do full time, is help companies transition to React in particular, because React's my specialty. Not all of them use React, but the vast majority do, since that's what I'm known for. That's who reaches out to me. But these decisions can be overwhelming. And here's the thing. If you look at this list, I'm betting that everything on this list, you look at it and you go, okay, yeah, I recognize that's a decision. But if I hid this slide and I told you, you're going to create a reusable component library, what decisions do you need to make? I doubt that you'd be able to list all of these. This took me a very long time to come up with them all because I had to go through history of years and going, what are the common threads? What are the things that I had to connect to finally create a component library? Because, gosh, it's a lot of decisions. And it's also, as a side note, a little sad that we don't have more standardization at this point. We do have a lot of component libraries out there, but React and Angular and Ember and Vue and so on can't interact with each other well. It really would be nice if standards help solve this longer term. But for now, that's not the case. So for now, we have fun conversations to have. And the process for creating a reusable component library is you get in a room and you talk about the problem. And it can be very entertaining. This is to some degree a religious conversation. There are a number of decisions. Anytime there are 50 decisions, it's like ordering a pizza, but magnified. I mean, imagine. So one way that you can help solve that is having someone just say, all right, I'm going to fall on the sword. I will make a bunch of these decisions up front, and then we'll pay attention to how angry Jimmy gets. And we'll shift based on the feedback of any cranky team members. That can work. OK, so I've queued this up a bit. Let's start with this. I said that I wanted to do just a little bit of coding just to tease the problem a bit. I have to, this is the same bug that bit me this morning. I have to tell if at any point you feel like you're not seeing what you should, say so, and I will fix the Mac OS bug for you so that you can see it again. It's not me, I swear, I know how to computer. But here we go. This is a documentation site. This is also table stakes. If you are going to create a component library, it is only going to be used if people know how to use it. That's completely obvious, right? But this is the other place that I see companies falling down. The company I'm consulting with right now is struggling in exactly that space. I said, where are the docs? And they said, well, there's some here in Confluence, there's some over here in Storybook, there's some over here in this other Confluence, and then someone wrote this Dropbox paper over here. No, what is this? So when we hear that sounds obvious, but it is really easy to happen unless you have someone who says, we need to treat this like a product. And when I say product, so this is a reusable component library that I built for a large healthcare company. Unfortunately, this is not open source, so I'm just kind of showing you visuals here. But I want you to notice, though, top left hand, what's there? A logo with a name. That's not the name of the company. This is the name of the component library. We wanted to give it a short name, something catchy, a logo to go with it, treat it like a public product, because in the end, it is a product. And if you want developers to use it, they need to know what it's called. They need to have this sense of stability as well, because here's what you're up against. This component library behind the scenes uses some components that are open source, not surprisingly. This is one thing that I recommend. Stand on the shoulder of giants. Do not start from scratch. In fact, nearly without exception, every component that I'm building these days starts by looking at some good open source project and saying, that does most of what I need. Now let me tweak it. That's wonderful. And in fact, there are some really compelling component libraries out there that fixate on accessibility. Reach UI is an example of that, where you say, I'll take these components, and they're rather unopinionated on look and feel. Now I can tweak them, and I can trust that I'm going to write an accessible application. So I show these docs because one thing that you might miss is how good the docs need to be actually be useful. So let me show a couple of things that are in here. One thing at the top is drawing attention to the fact that a new release has happened. So anytime people go to the docs site, they're reminded, oh yeah. Another thing that I recommend doing is setting up a channel on Slack or Teams, if you're unlucky, sorry, I couldn't resist. Microsoft's going to take away the MVP. So if I do this, this tells everybody, yes, we've got something new, and this is helpful. And notice I can click immediately, and I'm taken to release notes. This is another thing that any open source project needs. And I need to be detailed. I need to be detailed enough that people know what's a breaking change, what is a feature, what's a fix? So notice this says fixes. Down here, breaking changes in this, and this is unfortunate. This should say 5.0.0, but there was actually a little snafu in our 5.0 release, so we had to increment numbers, but this is basically the 5.0 release. Related to that is semantic versioning, not romantic versioning, semantic. So semantic versioning says the first number is breaking, the second number is a feature, the third number is a fix. Breaking, feature, fix. And that means if I require somebody, here's an example of a breaking change that, well, I can't tell if it's, I have an example down here, but it doesn't really matter much that I find it. It was a typo in a prop name. That was a major release for us. 3.0 was, we left the letter U out of this prop name. So that is a breaking change. Somebody has to go rename that prop. Now, romantically, I did not want to do that. But semantically, I did. So we honored semantic versioning. What you have to manage, though, if you're on the team that's doing all of this, you have to go to leadership and say, look, leadership, you're going to see a fair number of major versions. Do not read major version as, oh my word, we just boiled the ocean. That's not what it means. It merely means there was at least one change that someone has to make in their code to use the new version. And in fact, we've had 5 major versions, but if I needed to upgrade from version 1 to version 5, I could do it in a few minutes. It's a pretty small ripple, actually, because we're honoring semantic versioning. And that's over, a 1.5-year period that we've had 5 major releases, which might sound like a lot, but it actually isn't when you get into the details. Also notice you can click on these, you can go to the PR, you can see the diff, all those things are useful. Your release notes need to be really good, and also I'm a believer that there's no shortcut to this. I've seen people try to generate change logs and use commit messages and special techniques to put tags in and all that stuff. I personally don't think that works, and I don't think that works because I need to write this to think about what the end user wants to see, and that's different than what I'm going to put in any commit message. The commit message is for developers. These are for end users. So I keep a clear separation there, but I know there's some people that feel differently. So I'm going to back away from that soapbox quickly. I can see the people in the back getting angry. Okay. So we're going to talk about a particular component. I'm going to go up here to search. Side note, search is important. It's dang important. And in fact, the search on this documentation site is really good. What you'll notice is I just typed the word message in, and I have things showing up there that don't even have the word message in them, because behind the scenes, I have a tagging system. So banner item and inline alert, those are related to messages. Somebody may want to deliver a message, but they might not realize, oh, maybe I should use inline alert, or maybe I should use banner item instead. And in fact, when I click over here on message, so I'm taken to this component. And you'll notice if I scroll down a bit, oh, actually, this isn't an example. Let me look at a different one. Here's an example on alert. Notice how I have related components listed here. I also have a z-index issue. Ignore the man behind the curtain. Let me scroll a little more here. Fix that. This is useful because one of the most common mistakes in reusable components is somebody using the wrong component altogether. And what it leads to is people coming into the channel and saying, this thing doesn't work for this use case. And you go, yeah, because you're trying to drive a nail with a shoe. Let's talk. There's a better tool in the toolbox. So I'm going to go back to message here. Let's go back here. Here's the component that I want to talk about. This might not seem like the traditional reusable component, and I would say it isn't. In my experience, this is one of the trickiest reusable components that we've created. And I want to bring it up because this is higher level. And when I say higher level, some would describe this as a molecule or an organism. So I'm using, notice we're going back to science class here for a second. The terminology that I'm using comes from a guy named Brad Frost, who created a book called Atomic Design. This is a free read, and this blog post does a fine job of summing it up. He has a good image down here that really gets to the core of the matter. He says, think about your components using scientific terms. Start simple with atoms. If you're going to take a few components and put them together, this would become a molecule. Then you go to organisms and so on. Somebody left a battery out here just to troll me. Here we go. So an atom can't be broken down anymore, at least I think. In this model, we're going to go with it. Okay. Don't go down that road. I'm getting distracted. So an atom would be a button. You can't break a button down. A button is a button. But what if I took a couple of buttons together, I put them in a div, and I gave them a title across the top, and I called it a card? Well, that's a molecule. I've taken some atoms, the card, which contains my header and my buttons in it. Now I've created a molecule. Maybe I go a little bit farther and I put some things together, and now we've got messages that display together and buttons and different icons. That might be an organism. It's a larger grouping. Now, these are not hard, fast lines. There's a gray line to consider here, but what's really useful is having this general vernacular among your team and saying, are we trying to create an atom here, or maybe we're going too far and trying to bite this off? This company that I'm consulting with that I said had the whole failure on the first reusable component library, this was the new mistake that they were headed down yesterday, which was, okay, we've created our atoms, we haven't even tried them in an app yet, and our next step is, let's create templates out of them. I went, no, you're jumping past all these lines in between, and that is a really hard thing to do well, especially when you don't even know if the atoms work. You haven't even tried to put a button on the page yet, so walk before you run. So instead, what we're pivoting toward is, we're going to put the buttons on the page, we're going to put some inputs on the page, and then we're going to slowly replace these pages to use the reusable component library. Okay, so here's this component. Now this component is interesting because it's composed of other components. On the left-hand side, you see that AF. That stands for Anthony Fauci, y'all, come on. And it actually says so down below in the little gray text. And I know for the back rowers, that's got to be pretty darn small. Here's another little note. Notice what just happened. When I zoomed far enough, it went into a mobile layout. You might say, well, wait, mobile layout, why bother with the mobile layout? This is just a doc site. It matters. It really does. And it matters partially because how often do you find yourself using like half the window over here? It was driving me nuts that it wasn't mobile friendly, because really what I needed was narrow window split on my laptop friendly. So it does matter. So this API was tricky. It's composing a few different components. Let me introduce you to the actors in our story. This little colorful icon over here on the left is an avatar. So I come over here to avatar. Here's our avatar. Avatar has 3 sizes. You can put a picture in there, or you can put in initials. And when you do initials, colors get assigned automatically, so we're conveying those colors. I also, while I'm at it here, just want to draw your attention to a couple other things that are important in your docs. Having a button to really quickly resize the page so you can get a sense of, okay, what does this look like on different windows? This is particularly relevant for things like responsive buttons. Where's a good example? Let me go over here to, like this alert. Well, how's this alert look on a small? Okay, it sizes down just fine. Everything works. So make it really easy for people to see those different scenarios. Another thing to look for is maybe I want to run this by itself, so put in a new tab button, which fails at the moment because I'm not on my client device right now. So you have to bear with me. Some of these docs are not representing my actual reality here. So another thing is being able to show the code. This code, when I say show the code, lots of people know, yes, you should show code in your docs, but if you want people to use it, that code should be copy and pastable. And I see this mistake all over the place. It blows my mind how often I see a code snippet and it omits the imports. So I go copy and paste this, I paste it in and it fails. And I go, okay, where are the imports? Well, now we go dig through docs and try to figure out what things they had imported to make this demo work. This demo right here, notice the imports at the top. I can copy this and paste it right into any project and it just works. So all the stuff is right here in the box. Okay, so let's go back to Mr. Message here. The other things that Message is using is these bubbles right here are icons, which we have a long list of icons that are part of this project. There's another icon over here. And what this represents is basically like an iPhone chat. We've got the sender on the right and basically this is me with my phone on the right, and that's the person talking to me on the left, or the people talking to me on the left. This is precisely why you don't see an avatar over here on the right-hand side. It wouldn't make sense to show my own avatar. If you pull out your phone, you'll notice this is a common messaging design that we're copying here. So now imagine that we're going to come over to our app, and we're going to declare a function called message. And inside of here, this component is going to need to accept some props. So I'm going to declare a type up here, assume that I'm working in TypeScript. Well, the question is, what should the API be for this? And I've deliberately chosen something hard here because it's not near as interesting for me to talk about a button, for instance. I think we know with a button, you're going to want to maybe pass it some content. The button, basically, the native HTML button dictates what you're doing here. There's no analogy here. There's nothing equivalent in the platform. So that's part of why I'm fixating on this more nuanced organism level component. So let's start with this. We're looking at messages between two people. Now, I said messages plural, so that infers that what data structure is involved here? An array. And it's going to be an array of, I think I'll call it an array of messages. So this will accept an array of messages. That's one way to do it. But you might think, how should we compose this together? Because we could say, okay, each message has some content to it, but we need other information about the message. We also need to know when the message happened. We need to know who sent it. And we also need to know some other things like maybe the message failed or it succeeded. So we can see here, at which point we may want to show this message. And then also, some messages may actually be in progress down here. So you start to get at how, man, choosing the API for this is tricky. So here's the most fundamental decision that we have to make. Do you have separate components for sender versus receiver? Or let me reframe this in a more clear way, because I shouldn't use those terms. This uses the term local, remote. So let's change the terminology. This is local, that's remote. So one way that you could do this is you could have local messages and you could have remote messages, because what's the difference? Anybody see this right now? What I'm trying to do is give you a sense of how you view some designer giving you this, because as a developer, your job is to then start thinking about what is an API that will work for this designer's vision. The designer's not going to tell you the API. They're just telling you what it should look like and how it should operate. Those are two different things. So this local versus remote. Can you point out differences between the left and the right-hand side? Local has no avatar. That's one. The color, yeah, the color of the messages, or I'm sorry, the color of what in particular? The background color. The bubble color, yes. So the local is kind of a greenish color. Remote is gray. That's true. That's two changes, two diffs. Yes? It used to have a delivery status, like was it delivered or not? So on this side, we have a status thing, because this could fail or succeed. But it doesn't make any sense to have an idea of fail or succeed here, because if it succeeded, I can read it. I didn't expect applause for that insight, but okay, I'll take it. Y'all are in a good mood today. That's great. Any other differences? Yeah?
Name versus pronoun. So full name. So
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's true. So over here, it just says you. Whereas over here, it says Ross Anton, Anthony Fauci, or down here, multiple people are typing because we can't even say who's typing. There's lots of people typing. Yes? Singular versus multiple? Yes, also true. So lots of stuff. It reminds me of when I was a kid and they would show those two pictures and you'd pick out all the differences. Oh man, I loved that. Yeah, that was good stuff. That's before the internet, y'all. That was as good as it got. That and Garfield. So, all right. So if we're going to design an API for this, you could just say, okay, this accepts messages, an array of message. Of course, then we have to get into a conversation about what is a message. Now, my apologies to anybody that doesn't know TypeScript, but hopefully this comes across fairly clearly. I've declared a type called message props. This is basically saying args that this component accepts. Now the type of message, well, now we've got to go look at, okay, well, what else is on a message? Well, there's lots of stuff here. A message is going to have content, which is of type string. I'm going to do this. This will make it a lot easier on us. Let's just put our code over here so we can kind of reference what's down below. So we know we need content. We know we need to know also who sent it. So sender, author is a fine, okay, we'll go with that. That's fine. We need to know when, so maybe like a timestamp. And that, I'm just going to say string here, but maybe you'd want to know date, time. What else are we missing?
Is success.
What's that?
Is success.
Now you just hit on the hard part. Why is this the hard part? So is success could be a Boolean. It's true or false, whether that message was successful. The hard part is, what if I set is success to false over here? Is that logical? We already established it's not. So our API just fell down. And this happens all the time in reusable component design. If I can say what your job is when you're designing reusable API components is, look for a way to make the impossible impossible. And that means you have to find a way to design your API so that people can't mess it up. And that is hard to do. So I'm constantly looking for, if this prop is set to this value, is there some other value over here that would be completely illogical? At which point we should make it programmatically impossible. There are a few different ways to do that. One thing you can do in TypeScript is you can create two different props. Like you could create a circle, or you could create two different types, a circle type and a square type, and say, okay, if you've set the radius, then I'm going to assume it's a circle. That's a contrived example. Another thing that you can do, though, is group things together. So let me show the API that I went with here, and then you all can tell me whether you can think of a better idea, because that'd be great if I actually killed two birds with one stone here. I'm not saying this is perfect. So here we go. It accepts children. A message has content that you display in the bubble. Now, if you're not a React developer, children may not mean much. Children basically means you can put anything inside the brackets. So children in React means that in my component, if I called message, that right here I can put whatever I want. It's just children. So if I pass children to this component, the children will render right here in the middle. Class name is for styling. We can have an icon button on the message. Because again, you can have an icon button on either side. Notice how this is an icon button, which is for downloading. And this is an icon button for reloading. So it is an idea that applies to everybody. So we could just put it right here on the root of the API. Metadata. Metadata is displayed under the message bubble. This is another one that we could just put at the root because it applies to local and it applies to remote, and we have pretty much the same thing. Now, notice, though, that what we did here, it has an object underneath, because what we wanted to do was make sure if you're going to display that content, we need to know whether it's an alert or not. Because if it's an alert, we're going to style it differently. So up here, if it's an alert, the metadata looks like this. We put this alert thing here. If it's not an alert, then the metadata just looks like plain gray text. So by grouping together under this single object, we've again put like things together and made it impossible to do something weird. So for instance, if we had separated these, what happens if somebody sets is alert to true, but metadata is empty? That doesn't make sense. I'd have an alert and then I'd have no content next to it. But now, since we're saying you got to have content, and if you want, you can set an alert, that's enforced. Yeah, Michael?
But you could have is alert on just the name and time, which would be kind of an odd thing. So for the ones that...
That is true. Yeah. So you're pointing out that I'm dumb. That's... You hate my face, Michael. No, it's... yeah, so Michael was pointing out that it isn't perfect. There are still edge cases. And this is the thing. I love talking about this API because it is hard enough that those sorts of edge cases, you may not hit perfection, but try to get as close as you can. Because honestly, one completely valid answer to this problem right here is create separate components. That's often the real solution. And honestly, the more that I look at this, the more that I think maybe that was right. But I feel like once I show you the actual code, I think you'll agree that's pretty easy to work with. And there's not a lot of foot guns left. I've gotten rid of most of the opportunities to hurt yourself. Okay, let's come back down and look at what's left here. The last one is the most interesting. This is why I've brought the whole thing up. Notice that it is called remote props. So rather than splitting components, I took all the props that are related to a certain type of component, I grouped them together under an object, and I gave it a name that describes what makes it unique. Because remember how I went around the room, I said, what's different? What's different? Well, the avatar, whether you can have multiple users, and whether the user's typing. Those are three things that only apply to remote. And if we had those out at the root on this API, then you can have weird things like say that the person on local is typing. That you're not going to show that. I already know I'm typing. My fingers are moving. So that wouldn't make sense. I'm curious. How do you all feel about that? Yeah?
Why can avatar be null?
Why can avatar be null? Well, because of an interesting requirement. And this actually happens on your iPhone today. Maybe on Android as well. What's happening is this. Anthony Fauci spoke right here. I responded. Anthony responded, and then this other doctor just butts in and says, hey, here's your lab results. Well, since a new person started speaking, their avatar shows up. But as long as I'm talking to the same person, it's smart enough not to repeat their avatar. Now, the problem with the current API is it doesn't actually enforce that business requirement. And I really wanted to, but that is trickier than one might think, given the way things are set up. It's actually possible, but I decided that it wasn't worth it for now.
It feels like so the message component is each one of those bubbles. It is not
the message.
a box.
Yeah, and so what Michael's pointing out is the message component is actually each one of these bubbles. This is a message, this is a message, this is a message, this is a message. So we're actually seeing an array of messages. So, and this will be a lot more clear when I show you the code. So nice segue, thank you. Can I go any larger? Let's see how big we can make the code. Okay, here's our messages. So we've got a message, that first one. We got a message, it has metadata. That metadata contains content. And then here's the children. We're saying hello right here. Then we jump over to the remote one. The remote props are, here's your avatar. The metadata is this right here. So to use it, you declare some objects here along the way. Now in React, if you're going to write JavaScript, within your JSX. This is called JSX. The reason you see two curly braces here is the first curly brace says I'm about to write JavaScript. The second curly brace is me declaring an object. It's an object literal. Yes?
Yeah, so one downside of this that I see is that putting inline objects like this as a passing in as a prop, that to React, that means that every time this component is re-rendered, that's a new object being instantiated. So the referential integrity is not there, therefore it causes it to re-render.
Yeah, so his point is valid. For anybody that's not in React, this is going to be boring. But basically, he's pointing out, hey, your performance is awful, man. Potentially. Now, given, I favor doing the thing that makes the developer ergonomics best. And if we need to deal with a performance problem later, then I can solve that problem in various ways. The concerns around an object being created on each render, in my experience, are rarely actually a performance bottleneck in React. Early on in React, I was very nervous about doing anything that might hurt performance. And over time, I've learned that the real things that hurt performance are way too many DOM nodes on the page, re-rendering way too often. This sort of thing is not going to re-render that often to the point that it's a big pain point. Also, the data set typically, at least in the sorts of environments that we are here, is not going to get terribly long. There's shorter conversations. But you are right. Trade-offs again. And there are ways that we could avoid putting these objects in here. But yeah, I have to avoid. Thank you. It is a valid concern, though. I agree. Any other concerns? Yes? Oh, what the syntax means? So this syntax is, everything that you're seeing down here is in a JavaScript file. And in fact, if I come over here to this is another thing that I want to point out. So this is a JavaScript file. It's actually a TypeScript file. But it has to end in TSX because it contains JSX inside of it, for those that aren't familiar. So JSX is basically HTML in a JavaScript file, but this is compiled down by a build process and converted into function calls instead. So what the browser actually gets is a bunch of function calls that say, render this HTML element, then render this HTML element. That's about it. So it's syntactic sugar. But what we're seeing here is inside of that JSX, if you want to write just some plain JavaScript, you put in a curly brace to say so, and then inside of here, this is an object literal. That's it. I also want to emphasize one of the other things that are really important if you're writing reusable components. Do not try to build the docs by hand. Do not try to keep them in sync with your code by hand, because they'll get out of sync. It will be painful. So my recommendation is to generate your docs. The easiest way to do that is to use Storybook. Storybook works for lots of different component technologies now. If you're not familiar with Storybook, it is free, so don't worry, I'm not selling anything expensive here. They have a wonderful experience, and this shows it in a nutshell. With Storybook, you also get something that I do not have in these docs, which is you get controls. You can go in and fiddle with the different props. Now, I didn't mess with that because, frankly, the people that are using these components already have a full dev environment on their machine in the form of they're building an app using these components. So what they do is they copy the demos that we provide, and then they tweak them a little bit. So they don't really need this. And that's true of a lot of companies, my experience. So this is cool, but not actually that necessary. And Storybook works for all the big players and a lot of small ones too. It's wonderful, and it keeps getting better every day. Super cool project. If you're using Storybook, I really want to draw attention to this project just briefly, which is Chromatic. Chromatic is a way to create visual tests using your Storybook stories. So once you've created stories for your components, for each one of them, this will create screenshots for every single story, and if that screenshot changes, it blocks the build. At that point, you go, okay, the button used to be red, now it's green. Maybe I meant to do that. I click a button to say approve, and all of a sudden, the build goes on. Or I say deny, and now somebody's got to go figure out why that button accidentally changed. So now you've got test protection for any visual regressions, which is super cool. That's not an easy thing to test using traditional tools like Jest or Cypress and so on. So this is really cool. Although as a side note, Chromatic is great, but if you want to go farther, I'm a big fan of Percy. Percy does the same thing, but more broadly, if you want to do screenshots for pictures of your app pages. As somebody navigates from page to page, generate these on CI. And the same thing, it's going to gate your builds within GitHub or Bitbucket, whatever you want, so people know if they visually regress anything. This is good stuff. One other competitor in this space is Hapo. I don't know their URL, but Hapo is what one of my other clients has just converted to. They have the least impressive website, but it does the same thing. So maybe you save some money with one. I will say none of these are free. You got to pay a little money, but I found it's a useful idea.
One question.
Yes?
So what are you using here? This is in Storybook, these docs?
Thank you. That's what I was about to say. Okay, his question was, what am I using here? This is using a project called React DocGen. So I said, do not generate your components, or do not build docs by hand, generate them. And the tool that I'm using to do so is React DocGen. Effectively, there are similar libraries out there for other component libraries, but effectively what you do is you put some comments into your code, and then it reads those comments and generates a giant chunk of JSON. And I think, is this a handy little, yeah, here we go. So we've got this component over here on the left, and we have a comment up above here in JS docs style. I'll see if I can make this bigger. There we go. And this comment is then generated as part of a chunk of JSON that describes my components. So to see this in action, if we look at here, notice if I open the message component. Here it is. The message component has all these props declared. And notice how I've got a comment above each one of these props. Well, this comment says content to display in the message bubble. Well, if I come over here to the actual docs and look at my props table, there it is. This came from that comment. This entire table that you see here is not something I wrote. Well, I created the template for it, but I'm just reading a chunk of JSON that was generated by React DocGen. So imagine that you had, thank you, Time Guy, that's very helpful. So imagine that you had a chunk of JSON that described everything about your components. What is your description for that component? What are all the props it accepts? What are the types of those props? Are they required or not? That's how you generate this. And I said required or not. This particular component doesn't, yeah, I guess everything's optional on this particular one, but if I come over to a different one, then we can see, there we go. So that's what I do when it's required. I put a little required button there to describe it. Now this is more work. It is more work to set up custom documentation. So my recommendation to companies is start out with Storybook, see if that's sufficient for you. The problem with Storybook is Storybook's really good at displaying components, but it isn't a full documentation site. Because what you notice is this site isn't really, whoa, something just fell.
Down behind you.
Thank you. Why didn't I wear a nice button-up shirt today? That would have been better. Okay. That'll sound really good on the recording. So let me zoom out for a second just so we can see. Oh, oh man. I'm glad you all are laughing because I'm crying. Yeah, here we go. Let's try again. No, no, please. Is there a professional here that can help me? Okay. I also feel like I really get a double chin when I do this. That's not good for the camera. Okay. Is it working? Still got a mic? Okay. Up here across the top, getting started. notice how we've got this big getting started for developers, getting started for designers, making it really clear that here, if you're going to use our project, here's some things that you need. You need Node, you need NPM, and then if you're going to install it, here's how you do it on a particular app. Here's the exact commands that you run. Or if you're going to add it to an existing project, then you need to set up some particular things so that you have rights on your machine to do so. All those little details, so you don't have to help people do this one by one. Just document how it goes. So that's one piece of it. And then if we go over to designers, there's a whole different set of stuff on designers. Like if a new designer joins the team, they're going to be interested in Figma. I can't show Figma because I'm on the wrong machine. And then all sorts of other little details there. Frequently asked questions, which we continue to improve over time. I've got to zoom out so this will work here. Then, as part of your component library, it is important that you talk about voice and tone and colors and layout, typography, fonts, spacing, all the stuff that designers don't care about, that developers don't care about, but designers really do. Designers are fixated on these things. So notice a lot of these pages, I as a developer, I didn't write them. I merely took their content and put it in here. So we've got an illustration guide, like showing do's and don'ts. Hey, here's what our illustrations look like. Here's examples of different pages and so on. So pretty useful there. Now then, other things to look at is things like accessibility. What's our take on accessibility? Why does it matter? How do we write accessible apps? And this is also an area that this morning I did a talk on accessibility. So obviously something that matters a lot to me. But I want to bring it up in particular when it comes to reusable components. So let's jump back to code for a second while this is on my mind. Let's pretend over here that we're going to create a different reusable component. We're going to create a function. This reusable component is going to be called input. And what this input is going to do is return, it's going to accept a few things. It's going to mix a label and a text input. So let's say type input props are equal to, and this will accept a label, which is a string, and, well, an ID so that we can put an ID on the input. That'll also be a string. So then down here, it's going to return this. We're going to return a label. And that label is going to contain the label here. So I will say props.label. Oh, and if I want autocomplete support, then I also need to say input props here. And I'm going to have an input. Boy, input. I swear I type better on ergonomic. I'm not used to this. OK, so input type text. And an ID equal to props.id. So here's a start. It's intermission time, guys. Let's relax. This is nice. That does remind me to check my watch. OK. Here's a question for the room. What can I do to improve accessibility here? Exactly. Put a for attribute on the label.
Or wrap the input.
Or wrap the input. Either of them would work. So wrapping the input would look like this. Now that input is automatically going to be associated with the label. So this is an example of a component that is now enforcing accessibility. This is a sort of mistake that a new developer could make on any given day where they don't know that the label and the input have to be tied together for accessibility. If you don't, a screen reader will merely say text input, empty. But you won't know what the text input is for. And so the other example, again, was I could say, with this approach, HTML4 is equal to ID. So props.id, and then down here, now these two are associated together using an ID. And I apologize, in React I have to say HTML4, but it's the same thing as for. So just a little quirk in the API there. Also ignore the little fragments here. Yeah, we'll make it happy like this or something. Okay.
Not happy.
It is not happy. And I actually don't know why. This thing's acting funny. We'll live with it. So my point is the same, though, that when we create components, we're trying to pave a happy path and make it easy for people to do the right thing. And sometimes that's for performance, sometimes that's for accessibility. And also, we're always considering the impacts on the user experience as well. So I've covered a very small number of these 50 decisions in our time in here. And I have 100 slides in here. And I deliberately didn't go through these because I wanted to focus on that API. But I do want to just drive home this little point. And I'm deliberately not going to go full screen because then that Mac bug will happen again. So we're just going to live with this. That's as full as I can get. People think that flexible is better than rigid when it comes to components. It feels natural to think, why wouldn't I want a component that's more flexible? In the same way of, wouldn't I want an application that has more features rather than less? That's an easy decision, right? It's actually nuanced, because at some point when you add more features to an application, it gets slower, it gets more complicated, it gets harder to understand, people aren't sure what settings are, and you've also created a whole bunch of settings that somebody could mess up because they don't understand how it works. So the same thing happens in components. So I want to show how lopsided this is, that actually rigid as a starting point is a wonderful place to be. And by rigid, I really mean ask this. How few how few props, in other words, settings, can we get away with? Can we start with just a couple? Because props are a lot like features in your application. Once you add a feature, it's really hard to kill it, because you'll probably find one or two people that like it even though everybody else doesn't care. And you don't want to anger anybody, so it tends to stay. Whereas if it had never existed, people wouldn't know what they were missing. So on this front, what I suggest is starting with a very opinionated story and then slowly moving past that. Another thing to keep in mind here is the tragedy of the commons, that you're going to have people walking into your office all the time saying, can you make this component do this? And as somebody on the team that manages these things, you have to be willing to say no, because you have to have a bigger grand vision and say, I understand why you want that thing, but actually you need to go talk to design. You've got to say no sometimes. And sometimes I have to say no to designers too, because designers want to do things that I go, if we do that, it creates a set of problems because it actually goes against semantic web. It goes against standards. We're doing something that is technically possible but is likely to cause accessibility problems, for instance. So that can be tricky. And the tragedy of the commons comes right down to people tend to be sort of self-absorbed. They want to solve their own problems, but this is a shared tool, so we have to think about it as a team. Okay, so I'm going to jump past all these, but I will say these slides are online, and I will tweet them out. Yes, I will tweet them out. A couple things I'll say in close. This idea, which I really didn't touch on, I briefly mentioned it. Start with components that already exist. And maybe that means at the beginning you just tell everybody, go use Material UI, because it's pretty good. That's not a wrong decision. It's any sort of standardization is better than none. Also, some people are going to tell you, well, crud, why spend all this time building a component library in React or Angular or Ember today, because tomorrow maybe Solid's going to be the next big thing and we'll all be there. Yes, things will change, but standardization during a period adds value regardless. You're still in a better spot if for the next 2 years you were standardized and reusing code, and then later, yes, you can pivot and standardize again. So standardization is not a lifelong decision, it's a season. Yeah? I will make it available, yes. And yeah, sorry, I forgot to post it beforehand, so I don't have a URL at the moment, but I'll tweet it. I am @HouseCore on Twitter, HOUSE. C-O-R. You can also reach me, pluralsight.com is where I publish courses. Courses out there on React, on C#, on .NET, on mainly JavaScript and React these days, though. That's my specialty. I also am an independent consultant, so I have been independent for quite a few years now. I consult through reactjsconsulting.com, which is my consultancy. It's just me and my wife helping out some. So I travel around helping companies transition to React in particular. So if you'd like some help, I do training, consulting, that sort of thing. If you watch Twitter, though, I will post the slides. Got a couple minutes, so I will hang afterwards. Also, I'm doing a talk tomorrow. If this was interesting, then watch out. It's the second session in the morning. And I should know what it's about, but I'm totally blanking because I'm sure it's useful, though. It's related to front end. Thank you all for coming. Have a great Codemash.